It's episode 42 of the Fintech Moshpit, and we're bringing back together again the News Roundup crew to discuss everything you need to know in the world of fintech. That's right, folks. Episode 42. Fintech Moshpit, and back together, the band, the crew, the group, the News Roundup squad. We've got Chris Hart from Level, Aubrey Hawes from Oracle, Scott Harkey also from Level. We've got our producer, Brian Adams, and the fearless Pasha sitting back there with solid lighting, solid microphones on mute. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tark.
All right.
Hey, good afternoon.
It's good to have you boys back.
Hey.
That's what I'm talking about. So listen, let's jump in real quick with a quick update. You may have noticed, if you are a constant listener of the Fintech Moshpit or a new subscriber in the last couple weeks here, some differences in our programming, some differences in our channels, our partners. Today, we're live on YouTube. Sometimes we're live on Facebook. Sometimes on Fridays now, we're live on the Charlotte Business Journal. That represents a new partnership that we have with them, that we are connecting really solid business, fintech, technology, small business content to a new world in the times of COVID-19, who is starving for content, for what they need to know, and is also starving for maybe a couple hopeful good news angles and stories. So we're all very pleased that the Carolina Fintech Hub and the Charlotte Business Journal have partnered in what is really a first of its kind revolutionary thing. We worked for weeks with the Charlotte Business Journal and the National American Business Journals Association, an organization, to create something they have never done before. And that is creating and providing live content on their platforms, on their sites. If you can imagine a large corporation like that doing kind of edgy, cutting edge things, I think it's a combination of some solid leadership on their side that saw the possibility of going into more bite-sized, digestible live content, paired with, to be quite frank, COVID-19, the time of coronavirus, people willing to take a chance maybe that they wouldn't have in the past and do something different, given the fact that they are seeing wild spikes in demand for content. So we kicked off the partnership last Friday with a great guest, CEO and founder of LendingTree, Doug Lebda. Since then, we've had some episodes. You guys saw the last time we were together, even before that launched, we had Jim Maroos, a top 5 global influencer in fintech. Yesterday, I had a great guest on the podcast, the founder and owner of Old Mecklenburg Brewery here in Charlotte. I think that we're seeing a new time, a new opportunity for the Fintech Moshpit, for communications in general. And a lot of you, particularly Scott, because I already know what he's thinking is going to say, is, what does all that have to do with fintech? Well, I'll tell you, sometimes, exactly, I can read your mind. We've been doing this podcast together so long, I even know what you're going to say. And my answer to that is pretty simple, and I think this is the premise of where we're going. Times like today, we're going to talk about Betterment and Monzo. We're going to talk about pure fintech topics. Other times, we're going to have guests on like a Doug Lebda, who has a fintech company. And we're also talking about how fintech leans into the community and puts together $1 million fund. Other times, we're going to talk to Sarah Balcom, who we talked to last week, the founder of Girl Tribe, which is a online and pop-up shop retail operation. And there's fintech that weaves its way into that, and as they're figuring out how to accept payments and process and exist in a new digital world. And then yesterday with Old Mecklenburg Brewery, it's just at times where everything isn't fintech, but fintech touches everything. And the quality and success of our small business community and how we can lean in and help them is more important now than ever. And fintech can do that. Fintech has that platform, has that ability. So before we move into the meat of the day, Pitt, let me throw it over to you. Any comments or thoughts on the new profile, on the new setup?
So I love the interview series. I thought Doug was fantastic. Talking to him in his home office, I thought he really gave some good advice for leaders in fintech and really leaders for business in general going through this trying time, which is as long as your financial house is in order, this really gives you a great opportunity to expand, see how leaders are going to perform under pressure. I thought that it was. I came away from that session with some key takeaways for me to apply in how I run my team here at Oracle every day. So I thought that was fantastic. So I like it. Is this a revenue sharing agreement we're doing with the Business Journal? That's my one question, because I didn't see that in the contract that came to me.
Well, luckily for us, we're nonprofit, and revenue isn't a thing that we ever even think about. We're a cost center, man, purely to do good. It is something that we started to kick off with them in a paid promotional content where they've built a microsite for us. They're promoting to bring folks there. But in the end of the day, we're experimenting. And we said, we're going to give this a go for 3 months and see where it goes. And like any good fast fail operation, like we all support so much, I think it's going to evolve on its own. I want to jump over to Scott real quick. Scott, you normally hate everything. You've been loving things during this time of Corona. Do you buy my premise of how fintech can play a broader role? And sometimes we're going to talk about more than fintech.
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think that it touches a lot of different aspects of our lives. I think my personal preference would be we continue to find that theme in these things. I think the lending tree side of things, that was really interesting from a business perspective and just learning some of those strategies. I think with the old Meg conversation the other day, I think I would have loved to hear more about how he's thinking about the payment specific aspect or the commerce aspect of the business, maybe more so than some of the other components. But I think in all these things, there's always a theme. I think it's good to have a local voice talking about things in the community. Again, you asked the question, so I'll answer in the context of the Fintech Moshpit. I think tying it back to some angle around financial services or tech is always a way to keep a center. But yeah, I think expanding out and including leaders from other companies and including those perspectives is definitely something that benefits, all the listeners and all of us.
I think that's a great point, and something that, as you say it, I think back to the episode, another important part of this is we have set up not a set of content or a brand. It's really a communications platform, and one that enables us to be very nimble. And each day, like I saw his post on Facebook, John Marino, the founder of OMB, and it hit me and struck me. And now that we have this platform on a regular basis that's growing and growing each day, we can move nimbly to jump in and say, this guy has a pretty center of the road business mindset call to action of maybe it's time for us to consider reopening for business, and we can move quickly on. I think I take away from your point there is I could have, without maybe, seeming cheesy, jumped in and asked a couple angles in there, a little more specific to fintech technology, processing, transactional, that would have weaved it in. So that's great feedback. Chris, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I think I probably echo both elements of what Aubrey has mentioned and what Scott has said. I think the thing that's really interesting is you think about what every small business is going through right now, not just small businesses, right? Big businesses are having this problem too. Some of them have been doing, fake digital, or they've been doing, kind of lip service digital, and some of the big companies are in that boat. But these small businesses, there's restaurants and bars and breweries and all these local businesses that are suffering. And I think, that definitely came through in the discussion about what Old Mecklenburg Brewery has been going through. But I do think there is a depth to a fintech discussion and a commerce discussion, and quite frankly, just a discussion or an exploration of how technology is helping these businesses adapt that I would love to hear more about. And I do think there's value in the nimbleness of the platform that the FinTech Moshpit has, and the ability to pull people together. But I would agree. I really like the anchor to something in FinTech or something in payments or banking or commerce, or how these pieces fit together. And I do think that, just to go back to the partnership with CBJ, I think having access to a platform that gets that in front of more people, and to be able to just really drive home the relevance of FinTech. I think most people probably hear about something called the FinTech Moshpit. And if you don't already care about financial services or FinTech or banking, you're probably like, man, what a bunch of nerds, right? Like, I mean, these are nerds that are into banking. Like, that's a special kind of nerd. And the reality is like, I mean, yeah, I am a nerd, but also there is a benefit to being able to make this technology work. You think about the role that FinTech plays. The fact that you can place an order and Venmo money to a restaurant owner and then go get food put in the trunk of your car and not have to interact with someone, and people who work for that restaurant are continuing to get paid, and that restaurant owner is continuing to at least make some money. I mean, that is FinTech. And I think that that angle is super important to come through when we get new people exposed to this topic.
Dude, you nailed it there. You absolutely nailed it there. And I think that summarized all of your perspectives, summarized how my feelings were of the last week or two, which is like, awesome. This is great. There's room to grow and improve, but there's also ways to evolve FinTech itself in these conversations. And if you just think about an angle of my conversation with OMB's founder, John Marino, yesterday, one of the things was the call to action was, we're going to be in this COVID time for a while now, right? It's going to be a while. And in order for us to get to a point where we're not losing and killing off hundreds of small businesses every day, we've got to get to what is the new normal and the expectation. And that is not essential and non-essential businesses. It's safe and unsafe practices, right? And one big factor in that, and OMB and their facility and every other small business in town is the same thing, is how do you arrive there? How do you interact when you're consuming their goods or using their services? How do you leave? And part of leaving is, how do you pay? And part of paying is FinTech. And it's the paper money world isn't just uncool and, old school anymore. It's potentially dangerous. It's potentially a hindrance to all this. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see where this plays out. Pasha, we never call on you because you're always the guy out there scanning for feedback online, for questions that people have. I mean, what do you think?
Why don't we start with having him answer who he's mailing letters to and why he's packaging up letters.
I love that licking the envelope there.
Is he getting FinTech questions by the Postal Service?
So the Carolina FinTech Hub, advancing the future of FinTech in the Carolinas, has only one transactional method, which is snail mail check. We'll come back to that at a later time. But I actually got $50 on Venmo today through Facebook Marketplace. So it's cool to see the peer-to-peer Craigslist transition virtually as well. Let's not talk about the other cash-only businesses I operate. Back to you,
Pasha's been dating on Craigslist for so long now. It's great to see him transacting business, which is fantastic. Final thing before we go into our two main topics of the day. Brian, producer, let me go over to you. You've been with us from the beginning of this. You've been producing this show. You've seen it evolve. We've jumped in. We're still figuring stuff out. What's your take?
Yeah, it's incredible to see just how everyone's really banded together during this time, and how people are really using technology that's available to them in a way that, maybe they haven't used it before, but they're finding ways to transact, to, get what they need. And it's just tremendous to see that in this time that, folks are banding together using what's available. And, I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue doing just that.
Amazing. Agreed. All right, Chris Hart, take us into the first of our major two topics today in FinTech. Scott, in pure FinTech related, direct FinTech news, what's going on with Betterment and why is it relevant? Why do people need to know?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for those who haven't seen, there was some news that came out. Actually, it was just a little over 24 hours ago that Betterment is launching checking and savings products. So for those of you who don't know, Betterment is one of these kind of new-fangled robo-advisory, investing, saving, wealth building kinds of platforms. And the thing that is, I think, interesting about the Betterment announcement is it has parallels to what we were talking about a couple months ago with Robinhood, right? And for those of you who were listening back then or remember this news, Robinhood had launched a debit card, and they launched, what was effectively kind of like a savings account, but they didn't exactly call it that. And then they got into a bunch of regulatory trouble, and they had to retreat a little bit and then kind of come back, and with the proper regulatory approvals and oversight and supervision, are now able to offer that product again. And I think this announcement by Betterment really parallels that. I think it reveals again the fact that as you see these fintech companies that are coming in, and they start with a very narrow niche of, we're going to just do this one really specific product really, really well, but there's a need to start to branch out and provide other services. And I think this is just another example of a fintech that's doing that. I think the one other interesting thing about the Betterment announcement was that in the TechCrunch article that announced this, they talk about partnering with NBKC, which is a really small bank that most people probably haven't even heard of. And I think this introduces kind of a second interesting theme of fintechs partnering with banks, the importance that traditional banks can play in this ecosystem. And from a strategic perspective, the fact that some fintechs are saying, hey, we're going to go apply for a bank charter and do it our own way. And others are saying, no, I'm going to find a partner that enables me to get access to the traditional banking system and build products on top of that. So it's just an interesting kind of exploration of a continuation of that trend.
Aubrey, what do you make of this? Because I'm trying to piece the normal conversations we used to have about news like this into how is it relevant for now, and then whatever the new normal is going to be after that. I mean, what's your take when you read this and saw this?
Well, so the one view I had was, first is this is probably the first challenge for passive investing, robo investing in a very fluctuating market, where I don't think the view is, all boats will rise. I think there's going to be clear winners and losers in this post-COVID-19 world where everything's going to go back and change. And so I think Betterment looks at this and says, I think they're thinking, how do I now start to diversify beyond just that one business? So I think that's kind of, part of that whole thinking. But I think when you look at the bank that they're partnering with, I think what happens is, how can other brands that have a trusted status with customers look at a way to add another product where they don't have to take on the financial risk of getting a banking charter, and that's where they can leverage other banks' charters to go back and distribute their product and then just kind of brand it on its own. I think you're seeing that slowly come around, but I think it's a lot of people are offering banking products that may not be a bank. And unless you're one of the Fintech Moshpits, Fintech banking nerds that really go back and look for the fine print at the bottom of the website and says, who's really underwriting that product? Which FDIC and company is it? You don't really know.
You're a fintech geek when you sign up for a product just so you can get the mailer with the disclosures and actually try to figure out what's going on.
I've got like 35.
And I speak only for Aubrey when I say that.
Scott, tell us your broader take, but specifically, if you can also chime in on, what do you think the main differences are today, right now, between a fintech trying to navigate being more bankish on their own versus the pros and cons of having to partner with the bank like we see in this scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's a multi-stage strategy, right? If you want to offer these products, then the quickest way to market is to use an existing bank with an existing bank license and kind of negotiate those terms. So in my mind, Betterment could very much have a roadmap that says 2-3 years from now, they want to have their own charter, their own bank, and that wouldn't change anything about the step they take right now. So The step right now to me is they've determined from a business standpoint, there's benefits to having a diversified set of products, which includes, deposit accounts or savings accounts. The announcement I read said that who they were using for the checking product, the deposit product, but on the savings products is actually a lot more ambiguous. They're using a couple of different banks. They're not really showing that to the customer at all. They're moving money around and saying they'll do sweeps and other things. So their lens from everything I've seen is we want to be a financial advisor. To do that, we need to control your money across all kinds of mediums. One is investment, sure, but one is also your day-to-day cash flow, so your deposit account, and then another is your savings. And so their model is in we will help advise you on how best to manage your money. And I think the recognition is to do that, we need to touch not only your investment money, but also your spend money and your savings money, et cetera. So fits in nicely. And again, I think to the choice of like not pursuing a specific bank charter right now, to me, that's just a moment in time thing of at some point, if they wanted to go down that path, they could. I think to your other question of the benefits of it, I think it's ultimately about control in that, there's a pricing element for sure, right? In that they're having to pay someone for usage of that bank license. And that may or may not be more affordable if they had their own license. It just depends on a bunch of different factors. I think it's more likely to do with the amount of control they have over product decisions as influenced by that. So one of the biggest constraints or guidance of what can and can't be built inside a bank is essentially the regulatory stance, right? So regulations say a thing, you can interpret that thing 100 different ways. And the risk posture of banks very much determine how they interpret that thing. So some banks will interpret it very loosely. And that's where a lot of the neobanks, they have the same regulations. They just interpret them a lot more loosely. And they're more willing to get hit with a fine and say, oops, like, okay, now we'll adjust, than the big bank who's going to say like, we don't want that regulator anywhere near us. So like, I'm going to steer so far away from like the line that it's not even going to be a question, which means they have less kind of cutting edge products when it comes to pushing those boundaries. So I think that's the space, right, where ultimately you make the trade-off is do you get to market more quickly and leverage an existing charter, but limit your control ultimately over a lot of those decisions that shape product? Or do you evolve to the point where you want to take on that risk? You're willing to take on that posture in a way that helps you drive the product forward. And so I think it's an individualized decision for each of these banks or each of these companies as to when does it become advantageous to have more control over our product.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say, and just one thing to add on to that, I think it's absolutely true what Scott says about different banks having a different regulatory and compliance posture, but also the regulatory and supervisory bodies also have different stances. So, a bank that's like a top 4 bank is going to be subject to different scrutiny than a relatively small, regional bank. And I think that's part of the strategy that has to go into when you select a partner. Part of it is that, because the reality is if you get to be the size of a Citi or a Chase or a Bank of America, guess what? You're going to be subject to the kind of scrutiny that a Bank of America or a Citi or a Chase are subject to. That's what you get when you have that many assets.
Absolutely. And just from my personal take, before we switch gears to the other topic, I think you all nailed it spot on. I just think in their situation, being quick to market with maybe that full service capability, it definitely trumps all the other stuff of being able to own the back end in the short term. And I would have made that decision, but you got to weigh out, like, do they own the most important part up front, which is the customer relationship? Yeah, I think that's probably fair. And that's the asset they'll continue on. You can change the piping out later, but you are compromising, because with the downside of maybe I'm not ready to take on that risk and compliance and that overhead from that perspective. On the other side, you don't get to control all those pipes that ultimately do impact and influence the end user experience. And while maybe that's something you're willing to say, that's all right, I own it and I'm going gangbusters now, eventually, when you get to a certain point, that comes back and bites you. So it'll be interesting to follow this along. I don't know that they could have made any other better decision than that. Aubrey, why don't you transition and tell us what the other topic of the day is, Monzo, and why that's of interest?
Yeah, so the other news of the day is neobank or digital challenger bank or fintech Monzo, who is entering the U.S. has entered the U.S. market. They're looking to file for an OCC charter. This is this article is from the Telegraph out of the UK. Monzo is one of the big UK challenger banks. They're talking about how they've leapfrogged Revolut. When you look at it, it's interesting. Monzo, in this article that was out today, says they have 4 million customers. I went back and looked to see the market cap for Monzo was 2.5 billion last June when they took on about 144 million from the Accelerator Y Combinator. And in that article, they had 2 million customers. So it's, not even 12 months later, they've actually doubled their customer count. And so I think what's interesting is here you see we've got a few kind of domestic challengers with Varo or Chime that have kind of entered in the market, and you're starting to see some of these UK challenger banks looking to enter the market, but they want to enter it very much the same way they operate back in their own home country, which is under their own charter, running their own systems, versus what we see Betterment doing, where they want to partner with another bank to go back and offer those products. It's a long road, as we saw. We know Square. I think we talked about that maybe 2 or 3 Moshpits ago. They finally got their ILC charter approved. But, this article is talking about 18 months to 2 years, which I would say most of the banks that I've seen on that list, that is pretty appropriate. And I think that's the other, back to Scott and Chris's comments, the reason Betterment probably decided, hey, we don't want to wait 2 years to get that charter. They're probably thinking, listen, I don't have the product flexibility, but at the end of the day, I don't really need the product flexibility around my transactional account. I want to know how much free cash flow they have in there that they could be putting on the invest side. And that's probably why they just maybe made that trade-off. So it will be interesting to see if any of these UK challengers can get the customer market share in the United States the way that they've been able to do in their home country or even some of the others in Central Europe. Thoughts, guys?
2 years. Wow. I mean, Chris, Scott, what do you say to that?
I think in the same way I talked about the Wealthfront approach, I think you see them launch in the US before they have that charter. I think they do it with a partner ahead of that, because otherwise I don't see the point in announcing ahead of, right? It came out, I think, middle of last year that they were launching in the US. To now in this time of year be talking about pursuing a bank license, that if they're really bad at marketing, if that is indeed the plan, is to wait 2 years before they actually launch. So I suspect it's a lot more likely that they are pursuing, additional like parallel strategies. They want the charter. They want to be able to control all dynamics of it, because they're, unlike Wealthfront, that is a different product that wants to add banking services. Monzo is a bank, and I think it's pretty smart to ultimately want to control all aspects of that, to be able to pull all the levers the right way. But at the same time, I think they've done enough work to make the brand known in the US that it would indicate to me plans to launch sooner than that. And the only way they'd be able to do that is with a banking partner. So I think it's kind of more of the same.
Scott, follow up to you, would a banking partner jump on board with someone they knew was going to be their competitor within 2 years?
All day, every day.
Absolutely.
Right?
How do you mitigate that? Are you trying to screw them in the back end or something? Like what are you doing to mitigate? Like, I'm going to invest, ginning up the connections to our piping to make all this work. If you're on the bank side, I guess you see the short-term and midterm dollar signs, but like, I don't know that I'd be making that decision unless I had some kind of guarantees in there that you're not going to come in and just cannibalize me in our partnership there.
Yeah, I think it's a different type of bank that we're talking about, though, right? Like they're not going to get Bank of America to underwrite their accounts. They're going to get Cross River, or they're going to get a bank that's offering bank as a platform. And to those banks, all they care about is transactions on the system and paying people paying for those. So it's less relevant. Like they're not competing for the customer; they're competing for volume. And at the end of the day, this is exactly their target of a client. And if they get them for 2 years, great, right? Like that's 2 years worth of volume. So I think that's probably the important distinguisher or distinction is in, the type of bank that they partner with is the bank that's positioned themselves as these platform banks that aren't competing on customer acquisition or brand. They're purely trying to capture volume onto the pipes they've already built.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I would say is with the banks that's going to underwrite this or basically provide the banking service to them are competing on cost. They have figured out the cost equation and the ability to do that in an efficient manner. They don't care about the acquisition, what's it going to cost for me to go back and acquire new customers, go back and do the digital marketing. I think they don't want to get in that business. I think they realize what their niche is, and so they can figure out they can squeeze that cost. And so once Monzo has their own system running, I think their view is, hey, if Monzo is successful enough and able to go back and get their own customers, then there'll be 20 other banks like them that can come on board to that other platform.
Chris, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that Aubrey and Scott have said. I think the one other thing I would add is that there may be a view, at least for some banks, that the type of customer that Monzo is going after isn't a profitable customer for some types of banks, and so there might also be a calculus there that, it's one thing to say if the metric that you're trying to optimize is how many accounts or how many customers do I have, then that's fine. But if you're trying to optimize for net interest income, or if you're trying to optimize for lending performance or credit risk, you might make different decisions about the types of customers that you go after. And Monzo clearly has a strategy that they've used in the UK. They're going to have to adjust that strategy somewhat in the US. But I think that might be just another dimension to consider when you think about the competitiveness or non-competitiveness of Monzo here in the States.
Yeah, I know you guys are probably right on this. I'm trying to relay my experiences almost on the inverse of this. When I was at FIS, right, we were that back end, and that back end play was it. We actually knew anytime we ventured into a world where we might be viewed as a competitor to some of our bank partners, playing in some, direct to consumer role or something like that. Like there was a whole review process, and like that could be a big deal. This is almost the opposite of that. And I'm trying to think of it from that perspective. Like, how would we have felt if one of our banks would coming on to say, let's do this platform with you, or this core, or this, or whatever, but it's going to be for a year and a half, right? And that's going to help us get market share and traction. And then we're going to leave you, right? And we're going to be doing it ourselves, essentially becoming your competitor. I know there are banks that would sign on for that. I'm just wondering, like, what would you have to give me in return for signing up for that, being that partner that is essentially, having a sunset date on that revenue? We'll see.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
No, it was me. I was just saying
Oh,
stuff.
sorry.
We need you, an expert, to actually say words.
Yeah, I think that's somewhat of a bad mental model for comparison, in the sense of, if you take FIS, who's building products for banks, versus kind of going the opposite way of, you take banks that have found that in today's digital world, it's cheaper, or it's a better business model for them to compete for volume than it is for customer interaction, right? And I think that's the heart of it is.
But I'm talking about volume with an expiration date. This is not, that's the difference I'm trying to drill into, which is, yeah, I agree with the volume play. That's it. Be the back end. You don't need the consumer pains and headaches. Great. But what I'm saying is, they're going to leave you.
Well, that they could.
Well, you don't know it.
In the same way that when I buy from FIS, like I sign a 2-year contract and I can leave you in the same way, right? I agree. The mentality of an FIS or a Fiserv is very much, they hope to have you there for 20 years. but the risk is not inherently different in that if I signed a year, 2-year, or 3-year contract for one of those platforms, the way the world is shifting, like it's not all that likely that I necessarily renew it just because. And I think that's the same threat in the same way, right? Is that technology is advancing so fast that is the threat to those large incumbents, is that they keep and hold on to those contracts. So I get the mental positioning from their perspective of that's how they've operated. But I think it's different when you're optimizing for capturing customers in the way that a bank, like the mindset of the bank that moves into this model, as opposed to a company built off of trying to lock in long-term contracts.
But I think, the view is they're also betting that their application will get approved. And then the next step along that is that they think that they can run their own systems at a lower cost than it is to go back and partner with that other bank. And I think those are two conditions that may or may not be met. I think that's the other piece that you've got to go back and look at this. Even if it gets their charter, they could say, you know what, we haven't hit the customer growth targets that's going to drive me to say it becomes profitable for me to set up and run those environments, myself. So I think that's the other sort of game that you end up playing when you look at this. I don't know. That's my view.
Final question to the group. You have $1 million to your name, your net worth. Everything is in $1 million. It's in this bucket. And if you lose it, you're crushed, right? And you've got to invest that. Where do you put it? Betterment or Monzo? This is binding. This is verbally binding in North Carolina. So we will do the transfer right after we close the program down. Aubrey, let's start with you. Where do you put it?
I think I put it in Betterment, because I think at the end of the day, I think Betterment's model for doing this is a way to grow their balances on their investment side. And this is a way to go back and mine for excess cash that is sitting in low performing assets, like traditional checking accounts and savings accounts, that they're going to make a ploy to go put to work more effectively in higher earning investments that are not FDIC backed products. And I think over the long term, I think that's a better business model that will grow than traditional banking.
Chris,
I like the Monzo.
Where do you go?
This week, I think I'd choose like option C, an oil tanker. But
bury it in your backyard in cash. Got it.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I think I'm actually on the same page as Aubrey on this one. I think I'd go the Betterment route.
Wow, that means Scott, you always have the minority view and opinion. Scott,
Such
what
pressure.
is the correct answer?
Yeah, so I'll caveat this with, for the last 2 years, I've been telling Chris I want to go raise money and build a digital bank. But despite that, I would pick Betterment as well, because I think Monzo is going to have a hard time in the U.S. I think the thing that's making the neobanks kind of attractive is the experience. I think that's easy to replicate when it becomes obvious that that's the way to win customers and compete. The big banks haven't had to optimize for that right now. They've got other things that are kind of holding the customer in. So I think as that becomes a table stakes type thing, then that's an easy thing to compete against. And I don't think Monzo and the other banks have figured out how to actually make money based off the way they offer services. Betterment, on the other hand, I have much more confidence in their business model, even current state, and money to be captured in that space. And I think the strategy they're pursuing of taking on more of the financial relationship for the end customer even enhances that. So I think more long-term, Betterment's got the better business model, despite how sexy Monzo may be or any of these others. I think that's more easily replicatable, whatever that word is, and will ultimately be short-lived.
Interesting points. Unfortunately, the correct answer was Monzo, but thank you all for playing. Good job with that. It'll be interesting to see. I probably would lean towards Betterment right now. If I was looking for short-term gains, I'd go probably Betterment. And if I was looking for some Warren Buffett long-term value investing that I didn't care about looking at what it did for the next 2 to 3 years, perhaps that answer is Monzo. But then again, who knows? So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, this was episode 42, I believe, of the FinTech Moshpit. If we can mention as we close from our dear producer, Brian, who sends this note real time, that you can catch us live on YouTube almost every day, but definitely with our marquee events on Fridays, Friday afternoon. This Friday afternoon, we actually are continuing with our live stream. Pasha, you are just getting a great kick out of this. This is my favorite one of each week because it's where we can be loosest in ourselves. We're going to button back up this Friday, though, however, and we're going to be with the president of Bearings to have a chat with that fine gentleman. So week 2 is coming with a bang. You can catch us everywhere. You can catch us anywhere we are. This is episode 42 of the FinTech Mosh Pit. Thank you to our producer, Brian Adams, Pasha Mar, our great utility man, Scott Harkey from Level, Aubrey Hawes from Oracle, Chris Hart from Level. This is the squad that everyone in FinTech dreams about being around, learning from, and doing things with. And I have that great honor. Signing off, episode 42. Peace.